I am the man that is the middle-aged nerd. Here's something that bothers me. When I watch Jeopardy, I, I know that those people are smarter than me. That's actually not what bothers me. But I watch Jeopardy, and I watched for years with my grandparents, and depending on the day, a bad day, maybe I only know the answer to 10 or 15 questions. A good day, I might know the answer to 10, 20, 25, maybe 30 questions on there. But I still think to myself, if I was on Jeopardy, how well would I do? I'd probably get a few right, but those are some of the smartest people in the country, and well, the English-speaking world, really. And that makes sense to me. They're on TV. You're supposed to be better than like normal people. You're supposed to have something be special about you to be on TV, and that's how I've always believed. It's something that's a real bugaboo of mine is when people on the news. This is conservative news. This is liberal news, cable news, network news, local news, whatever. Neatness counts in football as a game of inches. And I've been waiting for somebody to correct this and point this out for decades, and they don't do it. People say that the United States, they call this country a democracy. And we are not a democracy. We are a republic. And I keep waiting for somebody to put the memo out that corrects people. Because it makes me nervous when I watch the TV channels and I watch the people who are getting paid, millions of dollars a year to keep me informed, and I know more than them. I don't like that because I'm not smart. I'm a really dumb guy, which is why I'm not on, TV. So I'm like, do they just not know? Did no one ever pay attention in 8th grade civics? People, they use the word, they say things like, they'll use the word democracy or democratic republic. They almost never say republic, which is odd because we think of the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, under God, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I'm like, well, far be it from me to just sit here and criticize the ignorance. Might as well try to enlighten. It's the same people who say that capitalism is installed. Oh, we've installed capitalism. No, dummy. Capitalism is just the natural state of man in peacetime, so to speak. Capitalism is simply put as the great Ron Swanson said, hey, I have some apples. Would you like to buy them? That's capitalism. It's not installed. There's no need for any government architecture like there is for socialism. But some people might find this interesting. There are actually 6 kind of main forms of government that have been developed throughout the 8,000 years of human civilization, however far back to Mesopotamia and modern day Iraq you want to go. The first type of government that was used by man was called despotism. Despotism, or a despot. Think of like the pharaohs in Egypt would be the easiest example to conjure up. You'd have one guy who would be like a god king. He would be all powerful. The people would just kind of decide, hey, this one person has the ability to commune with our holy celestial beings and divine some sort of wisdom that is outside the scope, and we better do what this guy says because he's in good with the Almighty and he will smite us if we are not. So you could consider a lot of tribes, Native American, Northern and Southern American tribes before the arrival of Columbus were forms of despotism. You'd have a tribe of 50, 100 Indians or whatever, and you got a chief, right? And the guy who gets to be the chief, he's the strongest warrior, or considered to be the most wise. He's the oldest, or she, in some societies made up by Marvel. Uh, so it'd be basically one guy who his word would be the ultimate law, ultimate authority. And now in ancient Egypt, not the Pharaoh couldn't actually micromanage the lives of every individual person, but there would be there'd be constables or police. There'd be different judges and adjudicators to settle matters. But ultimately, when it came down to it, Pharaoh's word was the ultimate. There was no one to oppose the word of Pharaoh. Today, you have small, underdeveloped island nations that are kind of cut off from the rest of the world that still have technically a type of despotism where there's just one dude who is just he's the king Mac Daddy of all. Um, a benefit of this type of government is if the ruler is a wise ruler, if the despot is wise, he can use the power of his word to say, you know what, we need to build granaries to store our harvests through the winter so we don't all starve. And people will either fear or respect, or a little bit of both, the word of the despot enough to say, okay, this is what we're doing. And if the leader is wise, then the community, then the civilization flourishes. If he is not wise, then the civilization does not flourish. But the biggest drawback to this form of government, this form of known as despotism, is it reaches a limit. There's only so big that your society can grow before. Oh, I have to sneeze. Sorry, I paused the video for a second. I had to sneeze. But there's only so big that your civilization can grow before there's just too many inefficiencies because one man can't, run everything. So out of despotism came the monarchy, we'll call it, sometimes called feudalism, but basically the monarchy. And think of England, think of Middle Ages, England, France, Spain, stuff like that. You'd have a king or a queen, but we'll say you got a king. Now the king is not a god necessarily. Some people may believe he has, communication or divine inspiration or something like that. But a very important distinction between a despot and between a king is the despot's word is all powerful. The king's word is the most powerful. Very important distinction, because a king acts less of a god on earth, just directing everything, but more like a landlord. The king will will basically be the landlord of England. He'll for basically, either you want to say own England, have a lease on his country, and then there will be lords below him. There's different levels of lords. There's, earls and dukes and down counts and duchesses and barons, earls, and something. I said earl maybe already. So you've got like different levels. Knights would be like, I guess, the lowest level of a lord. And these would be, also property owners. The king would own property, typically would be the wealthiest, biggest, most powerful property owner who could raise, the biggest army, collect the most taxes, have the most power. But then, like I said, there would be other lords and lesser lords and knights who would own land throughout the country. And the lords, you've got a baron or you've got an earl or something who owns X amount of land. The citizenry who lives on the land of that earl pay taxes to the earl, and then kind of like in the mafia, the earl kicks up and pays taxes to the king. So when the king wants to wage war, when the king wants to build a navy, when the king wants to build a road, build a castle, anything the king wants to do, he has to do it with at least the majority of the power of the lords on his side. Because if the king is getting reckless with too much war, not enough spending on infrastructure or granaries or canals or roads or shelters for people, then the other lords get upset because they're like, well, we're paying all this money to this king and he's leading our country to ruin. And then you would have revolts. You'd have other lords who could get together and overthrow the king, and there'd be a new king. And this form of government kind of lasted in some part. It lasted in Russia till the Russian Revolution of 1917. In World War I, the Russians were still they were feudalists. They were monarchs. They were kings and lords who basically had poor serf farmers on their lands, as it had been done for 1,000 years. Now, the monarchy was an evolution over despotism because it made for accountability of the king. The king just couldn't be totally reckless with what he or the queen she wanted to do. There was, if the people were starving and were not able to work and not able to pay taxes to their lords, then the lords aren't getting as much money, and then the king's not going to get as much money, and the power of the kingdom is going to lessen. So there are much more real world consequences to unwise, unholy, and weak and feckless leadership under a monarchy. Another form of government is a democracy. This was kind of developed by the Greeks. The Greeks really had it right in terms of men are born free and therefore should have a say in how their country is ran. That leads to a lot of good things when the voice of the people is allowed to be heard. But this is again gets to my bugaboo in democracy in the Greek democracy, and this is the main reason why our founding fathers chose a republic, which I'll explain in a moment. Democracy, it's good, but it's not good because it's incredibly inefficient and it is subject to knee-jerk reactions. So in ancient Greece, everyone had to vote on everything. You'd had votes for should we go to war, should we build this canal, should we build this library, should we burn Socrates at the stake, and it was extremely time consuming. You'd have people would take turns being they'd have like a city council. They'd have city councils in Athens and Sparta and Thermopylae and stuff in Marathon and the city states of those days. And everyone's voting all the time, and there's just not enough time for it. And then if a king or would make a mistake, then there'd be a knee-jerk reaction, and he would get thrown out. And it was a lot of daylight being spent on voting and debating. The Romans come along 1,000 years after the Greeks, and they say in around the 500s BC, a couple hundred years after Rome was established, and they come up with the idea of the republic. They say, it's good that the people should have a say, but it's absolute chaos to think that you're going to have a country of 335 million Americans, let alone a million Romans or 10,000 Greeks, and everyone's just going to vote on everything all the time. Nothing's going to get done. So what the Romans came up with was as they borrowed lots of technology, they borrowed lots of religious inspiration. They were very good at borrowing from everything from the Carthaginians and how they built their navies, to, like I said, to the Greeks and their gods and their architecture and their form of government, the Egyptians and farming practices, because they were humble enough, because and they were hungry enough. They wanted to be the best, so they didn't stand on circumstance. So the key difference between a republic and a democracy is, you know, we don't have 335 million Americans that go to the Congress to write laws and vote on laws. It would be absolute chaos. It would be madness. We vote for representatives. Republic represent to go to our Congress, to go to our Senate, to go to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, to go to the governor's house in our particular states, to go to the mayor's office, to go to our city council in the towns and cities that we live in. And it's a small number of people in comparison to the overall size and scope of our countries, but they represent our views. So you've got and it's not perfect, but it's efficient. I'm allowed to go. I can go to work all day, every day, to pay my taxes and provide for my family. I don't have to take 3 hours out of my day every day to go and vote on whether we should, chop down a forest in northern Washington State. You know, I vote for a congressman in my district, the first district here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I vote for two senators to represent the state of Oklahoma and represent my interests. And when I feel they are representing my interests overall in a good fashion, I vote for them again to reelect them. When I feel that they are not voting in a good in my best interests, I vote for the other guy or somebody else. And a good thing about the republic, which is why it's very important, I feel, because, like I said, neatness counts and football is a game of inches. It's important to know things so we're not ignorant. In a democracy, blacks would never have gotten any rights for anything, because you just keep having people who would just vote no to civil rights. It took things don't happen in a knee jerk way. You had Eisenhower in 1957 use the army to desegregate the schools. At the time, was an unpopular opinion, and if this country had been subjected to a democracy, who knows? He might have been, one of our greatest generals and one of our greatest presidents might have been thrown out on his butt. So it allows for our leaders a little bit more leeway to take a few more chances, to take a few more risks and see if they pay off. Because we vote at different intervals of time. Every 2 years on the federal level, we have a vote where we elect the House of Representatives every 2 years. We elect a third of our Senate every 2 years. And then every 4 years, we elect a new, we either choose to elect a new president or to reelect our current president. The republic, as proven by the United States, is the most efficient, productive form of government that also recognizes the rights of its citizens. And I don't just believe that, the empirical data shows it, which is why every other government has morphed or hybrided itself to be a form of our government, at least the successful ones. In France and England and in the European nations, they call it, they have a parliament. It's the monarch. It's a king in name only, but they have a House of Lords and a House of Commons in Britain. So it's very much, people have copied our type of government. The fourth type of government, which I'll touch on, No, I'm on 5. Yeah, despotism, monarchy, democracy, republic, communism. Communism is completely nuts. Communism is basically, and I'm not going to get into all the lies and deceits, but the face value, what we're told by, Marx and Lenin and Stalin, that communism is. It's basically the opposite of the republic, where in this country, in the republic, property rights are everything. In a communist form of government, everyone is essentially equal. Of course, in an animal form, we learned that some are more equal than others. You don't have individually owned businesses. You don't have groups of people forming corporations to own businesses, to pay taxes to the government, to carry out the business of the government. The state essentially, it's a planned economy. So in a communist form of government, you've got you have the general secretary. It's their basically the dictator, but that's their president. And then you have the heads of the different bureaus. The minister for labor, minister for commerce, minister for the defense, minister for state, and they say, okay, we've got to produce X amount of grain and meat and pork and fish and vegetables this year. Okay, so we're going to need this many people to work on the farms. Okay, we need to produce this many ironworks and and metal goods and they try to plan the whole economy, and nobody owns anything. Everything is owned and run by the state. So there might be a shop in Moscow which ostensibly sells bread, but everyone is essentially employed by the government. You're told it's completely top down. You're waiting on the political officer to tell you, how much you should, okay, the bread's going to show up on the truck. You sell it for this much. We'll pay you this much in theory. And the currency, it is always worthless because communism completely ignores the human element. It was sold to the people of the bourgeoisie. They're these rich jerks who they don't deserve their money, so we're just going to take it from them, and from each according to their talents, to each according to their needs, and it's completely insane, which is why every communist government is it always leads to ruin, because what you have. I'll give an example, which is in the days of Stalin, when he was really trying to take his country from basically from a monarchy, from a feudalism in 1917 to a communist, somewhat modern economy in 5 years. They go to the political officer goes to the farmer and goes to the farm. They imprison anyone who owned the land, but they get 50 guys and say, okay, we need you to grow X amount of grain, X amount of wheat, or we produce X amount of pigs. Okay, well, what do we get if we produce if we just meet our goal? Well, next year it's higher because they think, okay, this is a good farm. It should be able to produce more. We'll put the we'll raise the expectations for how much you're supposed to produce next year. Well, what if we don't produce enough? Well, then we have to lower the expectations. There's no incentive for anyone to work hard, because the farmers, they would work and they would produce, and what they found, and this is in the 1920s, when you had tens of millions of Soviets just died of starvation, because you'd have the people who would work the farms, and then the soldiers and the state people would come. They'd take all the food to go send to the people working in the factories. And since the farmers weren't being incentivized at all, they just would stop trying. All right, they maybe do the bare minimum of effort, but they were starving anyway. Why work harder and starve faster? It's a completely bonkers way of trying. It would be like, okay, I've got a landscaping and an outdoor a beautification business, and it would be like waiting on Joe Biden to tell me to go get customers or go do advertising, or it'd be waiting on Joe Biden or somebody he sent from Washington to go quote a tree job for me. It's entirely inefficient, which is why it fails every single time. And the last form of government I'll talk about is fascism, which you know Nazi Germany was fascist. Mussolini's Italy was fascist. Franco's Spain was fascist. Spain and Portugal were actually fascist into the 1970s. It was during the administration of Gerald Ford, which he kind of helped see them to a more representative form of government. Fascism, again, something that people do not understand when they say, "Oh, Republicans are fascists." No, 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 no. Republicans want less government. Republicans want just enough government, just enough taxation, just enough expenditure of that taxation to make the system work. No more. Keep as much money, i.e. power, in the hands of the people as possible. A fascist form of government basically works like this. We'll use, Hitler and Mussolini's fascist governments. Basically, fascists were smart enough to realize that communists were stupid, but they also didn't like the idea of letting people decide through any kind of voting whether they were doing a good job or not. But in the 30s and 40s, or in the 20s even, in Mussolini's Italy, you could own a business. You could work where you wanted. You could go to college and become educated. You basically could do what you wanted to, as long as it didn't interfere with the will of the government. You would have, let's say I owned a factory, or I owned a big farm or a vineyard or something, and Mussolini would come to me. I own a big grape vineyard. He said, "Man, I need the Rome needs to purchase X number of grapes from you every harvest. We'll give you this amount of money." And I might say, I don't know, I can't make it work I'll go out of business. So then they might say, well, what if we work with another distributor? It always comes down to slave labor. Well, what if we get you some gypsies or some Jews or whatever, not so much in Italy, more in Germany, to work slave labor? Okay, well, if I've got some slave labor, if you're going to bend the rules for me, maybe I don't have to pay so much taxes. Maybe I can cut a few corners here. Okay, I can sell X amount of my harvest to Rome or to Berlin, and then you'll let me do whatever else I want over here. And that was basically kind of how it was. Hitler, when he was planning in the lead up to attacking Poland, he and his the top Third Reich guys would basically, they go to the factory owners and they'd say, "Man, we need you to build X number of Panzer tanks, X number of Messerschmitts, fighter planes, X number of machine guns," and And the factory owners would say, "All right, well, I need this amount of money," and they negotiate with the government. And the government, like I said, would be smart enough to know that you know, if it costs you 20 Reichsmarks to produce a tank or whatever, you know, we can't sell it to the government for 15. We'll go, you know, tits up. But in a fascist form of government, the government basically has the power to say, well, what if we get you some slave labor? What if we, you know, we bend these rules? It basically, if the government takes an interest in your business, but they're much more friendly than communists to business owners. Hitler and Mussolini, and you could, you know, consider Hirohito and the Japanese government at the time a form of fascism, because they had their, you know, their emperor, their king, what have you, and you'll still have courts in a fascist government. You'll still have a legislature, but everything is filtered through the lens of the dictator or the party that's actually in charge. You know, no laws are getting signed into effect if Hitler or the dictator, the head of the fascist form of government, isn't signing off on this. And while fascism is generally, I feel like, more efficient and more productive than a communist form of government, it still leads to ruin, because when the people cannot check at the ballot box the authority and the decisions of the people ruling them, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's when you get World War II and World War III, where it's happening right now between the Ruskies and the Ukrainians, and God knows if the Chinese are going to attack the Taiwanese. I know, but that's for another video, another time, perhaps.